Good morning and welcome to the University of California, Irvine's 2001 toxic tour of the petrochemical corridor along the Mississippi River in Louisiana, known as Cancer Alley. My name is Kim Fortune and I'm a professor in UCI's Department of Anthropology. I've co-developed this tour and supporting digital archive with anthropologist and digital designer Tim Schutz, working with both community partners and a great team of student researchers. Some of our community partners are with us today as panelists. Dr. Joy Banner in Louisiana with the Descendants Project, Whitney Plantation, FIFO Lake Cafe, and Stop the Wallace Grain Elevator Group. Nancy Breuer, a film producer with Justice for Formosa Victims, Vietnam, working from Austin. Diane Wilson with San Antonio Bay Waterkeepers and the Nerder Patrol in Texas. Caitlin Joshua with Earthworks in Washington, D.C., and Tim Schutz with the Disaster STS Network and UCI Department of Anthropology. Tim joins the panel to help explain the purpose and process of building the virtual toxic tour and bigger environmental justice archive that it draws from. These activists have done incredibly smart, brave, and impressive work. I'm sure that you'll have many questions for them. The event is co-sponsored by the Disaster STS Research Network, by UCI's Department of Anthropology, and UCI's newly established Center for Environmental Health Disparities and Black Thriving Initiatives, and by a new student organization, Students Activated for Social Innovation, or SASI. I'm especially pleased to be partnering with students and hosting this event and to have so many students with us today. They are our future, and what they do with their education will be important for all of us. We're funded and very appreciative of UCI's Illuminations program. We also recognize that UCI operates on the ancestral lands and unceded territory of the Tongva and Agjacaman nations, acknowledging colonization as an ongoing process and the special responsibilities we have as a university to continue repairing relationships with Native communities around the world. Learn more about Native land acknowledgement at the link in the chat. Also read about the importance of Native activism in addressing the harms of the fossil fuel industry and climate change, our focus today. Our 2021 virtual tour of Louisiana's Chemical Valley builds on what we learned through a similar tour we offered last year, highlighting connections between the history of plantations in the region, the heavy presence of the petrochemical industry, and extraordinarily high rates of COVID-19. This year, recognizing the import of Hurricane Ida, which devastated Louisiana just a few weeks ago, our focus is on combo disaster and environmental injustice. We're experimenting with the virtual toxic tour presentation form as a way to link our research to educational and public outreach, supporting environmental justice advocacy. We welcome your feedback on how to further develop virtual toxic tours as an education and organizing tools. And we invite you to build your own, helping build our capacity to understand and connect across sites of environmental injustice. Our primary audience for this particular event is undergraduate students, many of whom are just being introduced to environmental injustice this fall. There are about 250 undergraduates calling in from a lecture hall on our campus, and at least another 100 participating virtually. During the 20 to 30 minutes to follow, I'll guide us through, I think, 10 stops on our tour, quickly sharing information about people and sites in Louisiana, then fanning out to describe other communities dealing with hazards produced by a Taiwanese multinational corporation, Formosa Plastics. By design, the tour characterizes environmental justice as both a local and globally connected problem. After the tour, we'll open discussion with our panelists. Many students will have to leave after an hour because of course scheduling, but we'll keep the conversation going with a more intimate group through 90 minutes. I look forward to the exchange. Later, you're welcome to return to the digital archive that we will move through in the tour to deepen your understanding of Cancer Alley and to try working with the interdisciplinary environmental justice case study framework that orients our work. This framework was designed to scaffold ongoing work to build a global archive of environmental injustice cases, using the work to advance understanding, advocacy, and our capacity to work together. Here, for example, you see an expansive archive of case studies about environmental injustice in California, produced by our undergraduate students. Already, you can see the great potential in drawing students into our work. You'll see as we move forward that we aren't actually within our digital archive as we intended. The servers we run on at UCI have been down. What you'll see is just a rough, quickly reconstructed alternative. We're very sorry about this, and we'll circulate links to the archive once they have been recovered. There's a lot to explore. I think in the chat, you'll see a link to a part of the archive called the Formosa Plastics Global Archive. Let's now move on to Louisiana, at least in spirit. We don't travel to Louisiana today to learn about environmental justice because there isn't environmental injustice in California. We had a stark reminder of this yesterday with news of a large, damaging offshore oil spill that contaminated local beaches. There are many parallels between California and Louisiana that need to be drawn out. California is known around the world for progressive environmental policy, yet there are shocking sites of environmental injustice across the state. Indeed, this paradox needs to be in mind as we think together about environmental injustice in different places. There is new momentum to address environmental injustice across the United States and around the world, and the California approach is often seen as a model for what needs to be developed. This is seen in initiatives the Biden administration and the 117th US Congress has taken to advance infrastructural renewal, climate action, and environmental injustice. This is very exciting, but should not be seen as straightforward. The California approach needs to be continually and critically evaluated, considering what needs to be addressed in environmental justice in different places, considering both similarities and differences. This is our challenge today, to build capacity to characterize and address environmental injustice in different places, building on while also going beyond work done so far, recognizing how conditions are primed for combo disaster, disasters fast and slow that involve intersecting vulnerabilities and harm, intensified by climate change, viral pandemics, and other accelerators. It is difficult to characterize, much less effectively address combo disaster. Louisiana's Cancer Alley tragically demonstrates what this looks like on the ground. The region is peppered by chemical plants with hundreds lining the Mississippi River, many operating on the same plots of land where there once were plantations powered by enslaved people. Today, there are initiatives to site still more industrial facilities in the region, many that are part of a global bloom in plastics production, itself a result of the shale gas boom, which has exacerbated carbon emissions, climate change, and associated extreme weather. The combined effects were visible on August 29th, the 16th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, when Hurricane Ida slammed into Louisiana as a deadly and destructive Category 4 hurricane. Amazingly, Ida, with 150 miles per hour winds at landfall, was one of the strongest on record in the state, tying with the 1856 last island hurricane and Hurricane Laura in 2020. In recent years, strong storms have seemed incessant and increasingly intense. Environmental reporter Julie Dermansky, who shot aerial photos of Louisiana shortly after Hurricane Ida, says that Louisiana after Ida illustrates what United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres meant in a recent statement describing the last Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report as a, quote, code red for human-driven global heating. There are links to Dermansky's photos in the chat. In some ways, Louisiana today is always in a perfect storm, a critical or disastrous situation created by a powerful concurrence of factors. This makes it especially important that there are creative and stubbornly durable community organizations in place to make sense of things, locally and in a global frame. We'll visit some of these organizations today. Our first stop is Whitney Plantation, now a historic site where visitors can learn about the plantation and region from the perspective of enslaved people. It provides a crucial lens for understanding environmental injustice today, helping us see historic production of disadvantage. During Hurricane Ida, it played an additional role, literally providing shelter from the storm for Joy Banner and her family in its big house, a house that Banner's enslaved ancestors helped build 230 years ago for a German planter and slave owner named Jean-Jacques Hadel. More of this story is in the chat. In our panel discussion, Joy can tell us about her experience with Hurricane Ida and the work it has taken to make the Whitney Plantation a place of refuge and healing rather than harm. Our next stop is just nearby, the FIFO Lay Cafe, founded and owned by Joy and her sister Jo to preserve their community's rich storytelling tradition. It is a place to gather and recollect the past in a way that opens new pathways for the future. In the last year, this work has become ever more urgent with proposals to build a new grain elevator and supporting River Port very near the cafe, Whitney Plantation, and the Banner's home. Joy and Jo have led this activism using the FIFO Lay Cafe as their base with important successes. The proposed project is now on hold. Tulia's Chapel is another important community asset in St. John Parish. It also has been the base for citizen organizing against polluting facilities in the parish, focused especially on a DuPont Dinka neoprene production facility, which exposes nearby residents to among the highest levels of cancer risk in the country. The chapel and the homes of many congregants were severely damaged by Hurricane Ida. Another stop is at the offices of the Louisiana Chemical Association, which represents the region's petrochemical industry. Industry representatives have said that Cancer Alley is a false description of the region and spearheaded a debunk Cancer Alley campaign. This creates what in our research we call data divergence, competing claims that are often a complicating factor in working to address environmental injustice. Data divergence has many sources. Sometimes it is because there are genuine differences in experiences or scientific perspective. Other times, the roots are oily. Other characteristics of Louisiana also exacerbate pollution problems, including dramatic health inequity. The focus of public health advocate and nurse Alma Stewart and the organization she runs, the Louisiana Center for Health Equity. The center is working towards a staggeringly important and challenging goal to raise Louisiana's state health ranking from 49th in the United States to 40th by 2030. Increasing environmental protections and lowering pollution burdens will be a critical part of this work. Because of the multiple compounding stresses in Louisiana's Cancer Alley with disproportionate effects on Black communities, it is particularly maddening that there is an initiative to build a massive new plastics production facility in St. James Parish, owned by a Taiwan-based multinational corporation, Formosa Plastics. Because of sustained, well-coordinated activism, linking activists in Louisiana to Washington, D.C., to Taiwan and Vietnam, the project is now on hold. Our panelist, Caitlin Joshua, will tell you more of this story. Our next few stops take us beyond Louisiana itself to other sites where Formosa Plastics operates, sites where the global bloom in plastics production and the power of plastics companies has created harsh realities, places that need to be connected to move to a new phase of environmental protection and justice. First, we'll touch down in Calhoun County, a rural yet intensely industrialized county about 150 miles from Houston on the Gulf Coast. Commercial fishing once sustained many residents of Calhoun County. Today, few people make a living fishing, though there are high hopes of revival. In 2017, environmental activists for Calhoun County, organized as the Calhoun County Waterkeepers, settled a landmark citizens lawsuit against Formosa, winning $50 million to support environmental monitoring, research, and education programs, and to rebuild the local fishing community. Plaintiffs, including our panelist Diane Wilson, brought literally buckets of evidence forward, supporting allegations of rampant and illegal discharge of plastic pellets and other pollutants into Lavaca Bay and nearby waterways from a Formosa plant in Port Comfort, directly on Lavaca Bay. The judge described Formosa as a serial offender. The case was led by Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, which describes the outcome as the largest settlement of a clean water action suit filed by private individuals. It is an important case to understand. The success is already shadowed, however, by plans to build a new port facilities to support the export of shale gas from Calhoun County. The port project works against decarbonization and will exacerbate climate change. It also will involve deep dredging of Lavaca Bay, roiling mercury-laced sediment in one of the nation's largest and most toxic Superfund sites, created by the operations of a now closed Alcoa aluminum refinery, which released over 1 million pounds of mercury into the bay in the late 1960s and 1970s. This is a combo disaster at its worst, when earlier successes in environmental protection are undermined by failed environmental protection today. From Calhoun County, we'll now go the long distance to Vietnam, where in 2016, a Formosa steel plant dumped several metric tons of toxic waste into the ocean, resulting in a massive fish kill along the coastline of 5 central provinces, affecting 175 people directly and over 4 million indirectly. After large-scale public protest and without assessing damages, Formosa worked out a deal to pay $500 million to the Vietnamese government directly instead of to victims. Tens of thousands of victims have not received any compensation despite loss of livelihood. Many others were undercompensated for their losses. The marine disaster has continued to undermine people's livelihoods, resulting in forced migration and long-term health problems. Several activists and journalists have been imprisoned for investigating the case, and researchers fear for their safety. Corporate power is difficult to challenge in Vietnam. The situation in Vietnam is still not resolved. In 2018, the Vietnam government announced it had completed compensation payments. A group of uncompensated victims filed lawsuits, but were rejected, citing insufficient evidence. When they appealed, they were beaten, arrested, and jailed by police. Those who spoke out demanding justice for the victims were arrested and imprisoned, including blogger Lê Đăng Long for a 20-year sentence and Hoang Duc Binh for 14 years. More than 20 others are serving long sentences, and still others are subject of intimidation because of their protest. Justice for Formosa's victims, the organization that our panelist Nancy Bory works with, has assisted with almost 8,000 lawsuits on behalf of defendants in Taiwan, where Formosa is headquarters. The cases are now pending in Taiwan's highest court. An important precedent could be set for multinational corporate accountability. This in turn takes us to Taiwan, home of Formosa Plastics. The company was founded in the 1950s by Wang Chongqing and his brother. Both became very rich and maintained strong ties to the Taiwanese government. Today, the company still contributes about 10% of the country's GDP. Stories of this success are told at the 6th floor Formosa Plastics Museum near Taipei. There are Formosa Plastics facilities throughout the island, with the largest in rural Yunlin County. Here, the stories sound more like those in Texas, Vietnam, and Louisiana. Oyster farmers deal with routine water pollution and diminished harvests, while nearby residents suffer from lung cancer and other respiratory diseases. However, there have also been efforts to hold Formosa accountable through improved air monitoring, for example, but also through ongoing lawsuits by residents. In the digital Formosa archive, you can now find translated documentary films and court drawings about the case. While there is much more to say about the company's long history, we hope you have begun to see many of the connections between affected Formosa's communities and the importance of better connecting going forward. To close our tour, we'll now return to Louisiana and the FIFO Lake Cafe, paying our respects to what Joe and Joy Banner and their community have accomplished there. Imagining the venue that they have created is where we come together for our discussion today with Joy, Nancy Buell, Diane Wilson, Caitlin Joshua, and Tim Schutz. I want to thank Joy especially for joining and virtually hosting us at her cafe. Over time, and especially in the last few weeks because of Hurricane Ida, Joy's community has suffered and lost so much, yet continues to step forward to fight for a better future. I admire her so much. Joy, can you start our discussion with your own brief description of the organizations you work with and the work you are focused on at the moment?
Sure. Oh, and thank you so much for that really warm welcome. And I'm sorry I'm not joining you from the cafe. It experienced damage during a hurricane. Luckily, it wasn't extensive damage, but as part of the nonprofit organization that I co-founded with my sister, we have been collecting resources, supplies, and other items for the community. So the cafe is currently filled with supplies that we are distributing to the community this upcoming weekend. So can't wait to get back into that space. Like you were saying, the cafe means so much to me and my sister because for us growing up as descendants in plantation country, so Cantor Valley and plantation country is the same geographic location. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But my sister and I we grew up with this fascination of history and heritage. And for this region, we don't have a lot of historians in rural communities. So the closest thing to the history profession is tourism. And so my sister and I, we love history, love the architecture of the plantations. And so really we're interested in tourism. Unfortunately, what we found is that our tourism industry, in particular our regional tourist commission, their focus is on the glamorization of these plantation spaces. So very little attention, very little narrative about the lives and the labor and the atrocities of slavery. In fact, their whole strategy, their theory was like, well, why would you want to talk about the bad things? You know, why would you want to put it on the surface, right? When Whitney opened, other plantation owners hired security for their sites because they felt like Whitney's interpretation was so violent, was so exaggerated, was so hostile that they would get attacked by Black people, I guess, who just gather together and march on, our river regions and start burning down plantations. So they hired extra security for their plantation sites when Whitney opened. But we fast forward a few years, I should say 6 years later, and because of Whitney's presence, many of the plantations have had to at least somewhat address in their narrative and acknowledge the enslaved people as part of their interpretation. So that's a good thing. That's one good thing of it. However, with me and my sister still advocate for is the presence and the resources for the tourism industry and economy for that to be focused on a descendant community whose ancestors built these sites and still allow a plantation economy to still exist, right? So, I mean, it's crazy that Whitney Plantation is 1791 was actually 1752, the plantation was started. And here we are 2021 and a plantation is still a viable, economic opportunity. And so we have been advocates for the representation of descendants within the tourism economic space. And that was a huge driver for why we created FIFO Lake Cafe. We wanted to own our own narratives. We wanted to have people hear our voices, to have a space that was created by us, for us. We infused, a lot of the stories and folklore and local, local accounts and experience that my grandparents and their grandparents that had the oral tradition that had been passed down to us. And it's my favorite memory is convening in the yard with my great aunts, uncles, and grandparents and listening to the stories. It was an amazing time for us. And me and my sister wanted to capture that in our cafe. And so that's why we created the cafe. And also we are very, very close to Whitney Plantation, less than a mile away. And so we thought that this would be a laboratory or a pilot to show that descendant-owned businesses could be viable and could be successful. And we were in 2019, we opened and we're doing really, really well. Our numbers were growing. Then the pandemic hit. And so we had to shut down. We reopened. We weren't getting quite the amount of visitation as you would expect. Then we picked up. Then the second wave of the pandemic hit, so that slowed us down again. And then the final thing was Hurricane Ida. So the realization, unfortunately, is that me and my sister realized that we are not in a environmentally sound enough location to rely only on heritage and tourism and service as a backbone of our economic structure. So that's where we still plan on having the cafe open as a public history site. We will probably amend the hours to accommodate our more activist actions. So the grain elevator is one community fight that we led and organized. And to condense that as much as possible, but still capture as much information. We found out in March of 2020, so March of 2021, that there was a grain elevator, a huge, massive grain facility planned right next to my community in Whitney Plantation. And if you haven't done as much research on grain, the problem that we find is that folks, when you say grain, it sounds idyllic. It sounds Pollyannish. It sounds like, well, isn't that great? You don't want chemicals, you want grain. But of course, we know that the grain is full of chemicals. There's fertilizer, that's used to combat the pests that's also in the grain as part of the facility. The grain dust, which is the most problematic. It carries that 2.5 particulate matter. The grain dust captures the pollution that's in the air. And so it carries, the existing pollution. We're already overburdened with pollution. Plus, grain elevators can explode. This massive structures would swamp, would completely surround my small community and Whitney Plantation. So since then, we've had to sort of direct the attentions of our nonprofit organization almost entirely solely. Before Hurricane Ida, it was, grain elevator 100% of the time. The good news about that is our wonderful lawyers with the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, also with the Center of Constitutional Rights, have helped us, and the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, who does a lot of work with Rise St. James and with Formosa. We were able to find problems with zoning ordinances, everything from getting public records for emails between state actors and federal actors and the applicants for this grain elevator, showing that they're trying to coordinate how much the public would know and how to minimize, the public knowledge and, get around the public comments, public notice. So we found out so much information. Also found out that our community has a 2,000-foot buffer around residential areas. So as we keep digging and digging, we're finding out more and more. It's getting really, really strange, really problematic. Misinformation about land use plans, which are very critical to being able to defend the rights, of your land. Seeing where Formosa, and I will say that the site of the grain elevator was the original planned site for Formosa, and the land was rezoned to industrial amid scandal. People that were involved in the rezoning of the land literally went to jail for it, for bribery and for fraud. But our community was able to fight back Formosa one time, but the ghost of Formosa is still hanging around us because of the zoning of the land. So that's where we are now. We have been able to find some crucial evidence. We've been able to get them to pull down their Corps of Engineers application. As soon as we found out about it, they immediately pulled it from the site. We've been able to catch them, trying to sneak through exemptions and all. And we got one exemption for their coastal use permit through the Office of Coastal Management. We rebutted, we petitioned OCM, and they heard our petition. And we basically caught Greenfield, which is the company, in a lie, and caught them not submitting information that they were supposed to submit. And then in one last piece, I just want to touch back. You had mentioned something about how to find data and looking for data in places where you don't normally find it. Well, the permits and the applications that Greenfield were submitting to different permitting agencies were different throughout all of the different, the relevant organizations that they were submitting to. But one of the key pieces of data that we found, or that we did find on the permit application, my sister found that on several of the applications, they had literally omitted our streets from their renderings. And so I think that that's one of the strongest arguments for Black erasure. When you literally have erased the streets, 2 streets from Black residents, and we've been able to come back and say, so you're submitting applications and you're not even indicating that our streets, historically have been in our families for 150 plus years, are nowhere in sight. So just those elements of data, there's compelling ways, there's creative ways of looking at data and making it sing for you and making it tell that story. And when I say making, I mean, the data's there. So I don't want to, nothing shady, folks, but, understanding like there's a data and then there is a story that data tells, and making sure that you tell that story is so important to the process.
I love that idea of making data sing for you, because that is the capacities we're trying to build in our students, the capacity to identify and access data, but then to work with it, actually figuring out what it means and putting it forward as part of larger political strategies, very tactically. So the examples you give are really great for us to think with. The other thing I'll make a special point of for my students is that in Joy's story, you heard multiple examples of procedural injustice where the community was not in the decision-making to rezone their area. They found out not through official sources about the grain elevator. I've learned separately from Joy that they struggled to get heard by their own parish council. And so learning to identify those so that you can use those to stay movement on projects like the grain elevator is a really important skill set for environmental activism. Joy did a really good job pointing to the way that the stresses in her community are linked to the stresses in neighboring St. James Parish, St. John's Parish is still haunted by Formosa. St. James Parish has had Formosa on their doorstep in the recent years or so. And Caitlin, Joshua, can you tell us a little about your work with Earthworks in DC and about how it works to connect Formosa communities and helps us all understand Formosa and environmental justice writ large as both a local and global problem?
Absolutely. And so Earthworks, the organization that I work for that works in the Stop Formosa Coalition with Rise St. James, Concerned Citizens, Louisiana Bucket Brigade, Healthy Gulf, the list is kind of long. We're based in DC, but I myself I'm born, raised, live in Gonzales, Louisiana, which is one of the river parishes neighboring to St. James and St. John. And so been here my whole life and still here and blessed to be able to do the work. And so for those of you who may not have heard about Formosa Plastics before and the history around the Sunshine Project. So Formosa Plastics still plans to build a $12 billion petrochemical complex in St. James Parish, which is the heart of Cancer Alley, a predominantly Black district that's already overburdened with about 12 petrochem complexes within a 10-mile radius. And so it's extremely wild. So my focus with Earthworks and with the Stop Formosa Coalition as of lately has been more specifically trying to stop the financial aspects of the funding for the Sunshine Project. And so essentially, alongside the No Formosa Finance United States group, we create tactics around defunding and divesting from that Sunshine Project. And really good news, as of August 18th of this year, the Army Corps of Engineers did make an official announcement that the Sunshine Project of Formosa Plastics would undergo a full EIS review, which would take several years, which is a huge delay. Delay in this case is victory for us. And so definitely counting that as such, but essentially, we do know that Formosa does not have approval from the Army Corps of Engineers to proceed forward with their permit, thus giving us more time to even kind of divvy up on the roles around stopping the financial aspects. As I stated, the potential financiers across the country, across the world, are still allowed to invest in the project. And so my role at Earthworks has been primarily shifting focus into stopping some of these banks, such as Wells Fargo, Chase Bank, Bank of America, and making sure that we're uplifting that and bringing that to light so folks can target those banks and divest from those banks themselves and stop engaging with a lot of these banks that folks don't understand are pretty much spearheading the efforts in funding a lot of petrochemical plants across the country and the world. And so before my 2-year-old walks in and ruins this, I would like to lift up essentially for the last year and a half. Okay, 1 second, okay. For the last year and a half, we have been focusing a lot, as Joy stated, on the local level pieces, making sure that we're getting some of the local efforts discussed in the Metro Councils. Okay, 1 second, baby. In St. James, to be able to have that conversation with our elected officials and discuss their influence and how much they really do have a role in some of this work around Formosa and the Sunshine Project and stopping that. So even though they may not have a lot of the influence around the financial pieces, there are still ways for us to be able, whether it's through the Clean Water and Act permit, through the permit that is undergoing a full EIS review with Army Corps of Engineers currently, and then also through that financial tactic that we're doing with the No Formosa Finance campaign across the country.
Caitlin, thank you so much for your work and that really impressive articulation. I want to point, there's a lot of things to point to for my students, but the way that working on an initiative like the Formosa protest involves elements, so many different kinds of expertise, including what Caitlin foregrounded is expertise about banks and the financial system. We talk a lot in our class meeting about the need for students with very varied kinds of expertise, some without explicit environmental headings, to see themselves as part of the work of building environmental protections and environmental justice. And you also beautifully model the important capability of multitasking, which all environmental activists have to do in so many ways. And so many environmental activists are parents. And so multitask in a way, it really is a matter of keeping many balls in the air, and you deserve our full support in that. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Kim.
We'll now move to talk to Diane Wilson, who is another mother and environmental activist and just incredible figure that I've known for many years. Diane, can you tell us about your work addressing the operations of Formosa Plastic and the kind of broader issues that you've come to be involved in? Diane, you're still muted for me.
Okay, there we go. How's that? Okay. Well, basically, I'm a 4th generation fisherwoman and a mother of 5, and I come from a very rural place that gets very intimidated by industry. You know, like when Formosa expanded, back in 1989, we were probably the entire county had a population of probably 15,000, and that's the entire county. And so when you have industry that comes in, that's pretty powerful. I mean, they put their stamp on everything, and especially the elected officials and the state officials and the state agencies and the federal agencies. And so basically, you have them coming in and taking over your home and doing what they will, even a polluter like Formosa. You know, at the time they came in here, they were getting bowed and stones thrown at the chairman in Taiwan. And the chairman came over and was seeing which state, whether it was Louisiana or Texas, was going to give them the most. And we gave them the most, is why they didn't go to Louisiana. It's like Louisiana just didn't come up with enough stuff to give them, and we gave them the whole store and our communities in the Bay. And you know, and I'm a little bit of a I was a reluctant activist. I was probably the most naive, unprofessional activist you're ever going to run across. But when it's your home and it's your bay and it's the fishermen, you know, it's your home. And basically, when I started out, and this has been for many, many years, my allies became really ironically, they became the workers inside the plant. Because if you have workers that are non-union at a very polluting company, an unsafe company like Formosa is, so you can't go to the company, you can't go to elected officials, you can't go to state agencies, you can't go to OSHA, which does federal safety violations on workers, you can't go to the EPA. And I think it says a whole lot about the situation when they would come to me, the bottom on the list. And so basically, that's how I got my information, because you certainly don't get it from the corporation. What you get from the corporation is this very slick presentation that is so full of lies that it is, you know, it's still got me jaded after 30 years. I still have a hard reluctance to believe what industry management tells me. And, you know, and so I learned a lot about plastic. I learned a lot about the, especially since Formosa was PVC, I learned a lot about the powder and how it affected the workers and how it affected the communities. And so over the years, I have collected thousands of documents related from everything from worker testimony to internal documents, to studies, to newspaper articles that nobody cared about, but I've been dragging along with me for 30 years. And I'm amazed that people, I've been quite frankly, very amazed that people like y'all have saw the value in them. I wasn't quite sure of who the value was for other than me and for my, because it's a testimony of what happened, because it's very hard to talk to people about what happens in your community when you don't have the stamp of authority. So people and agencies and writers and reporters, they have a hard time believing you. But when you have the data, when you have the story, it never goes away. It never goes away. People may try to forget, but it never goes away. And so basically, I've been fighting Formosa for 30 years. I've also fought the other local plants, probably Alcoa, which is one of our Mercury Superfund sites down here that is contaminated the bay where the fishermen have made their livelihoods for many, many years. So you know, we've got in this area of Matagorda Bay, where you have a very diverse group of Hispanic and Vietnamese and Anglo fishermen, and you have this dual mix of plastic pollution and mercury that picks up the mercury. You have a situation that can devastate the entire history of your entire community, and it stops the future. It literally stops the future. It kills the community. It doesn't just pollute them, it wipes them off the face of the earth. And so what has come out of a lot of the data, you know, and it's funny, like this $50 million lawsuit with Formosa, it was collecting data. That's basically what we were doing. We were collecting data every single day, wading out in the water to get it, going in kayaks 4 hours down the creeks trying to find it. And that's where we found all this evidence, and that we could use it in a trial, and we can tell the story. And right now, it's the thing that we hope will, what we're hoping it will heal some of the environmental damage. It will hopefully maybe bring some back of our community and of our fishermen. And it's paying for a lot of environmental research that should have been done out here on these bays. And so basically it's the story of my home. And as you well know, I'm a big storyteller, and I can take any piece of data and I got a story to every little piece that I have. And I am glad to be here, and I'm very appreciative of the opportunity. And thank you very much, Kim.
Diane, we have so much to learn from you and your capacity to storytell with your buckets and buckets of data. I can't tell you how appreciative I've been for many years. Let's now move and hear about Formosa's operations in Vietnam, which just expands and complicates the story even more. Nancy?
Yeah, it's me, Nancy Bui. I'm talking from Austin, Texas. Everybody can hear me? Yes, thank you. Well, my situation and with Formosa in Vietnam a little different. I am one of the boat people. After the communists took over the South Vietnam, we escaped from the boat, so they call us boat people. Luckily, I got into U.S. to refuse. Many die on the ocean. You know, it's about 500,000, and you know, according to United Nations data, you know, people perish on the ocean because of storm, pirates, and everything else. So I live in living here in Austin. I went to school in New Jersey, and then I moved to Houston, and I moved to Austin. That my trail. Anyway, in 2016, Formosa came to Vietnam. I think about 6-7 years prior to that. They want to build a steel mill in the country. That steel mill is supposed to be built in Taiwan, but they couldn't pass the environmental phase, so they decided to bring the whole thing to Vietnam, because Vietnam is a country of communists. So they try to do business like private enterprise. So actually, eventually, they didn't have any environmental law, or you know, anything that they have enough knowledge to talk about protecting environment at all. So when Formosa came there, and people saying that they bribed the government, we don't have all those evidence. But anyway, they got the big piece of land, 33,000 acre, and the coastline about 250 kilometers. So you see that the huge tract of land, and in order to clear the land for Formosa factory, they kick out I think a few village, thousands of people out of their ancestor home, and pay them very little money, so they don't have enough money to buy a equal house that they their house been taken. So anyway, make it short, when the Formosa factory finished building and they start doing their operation, so the first batch they try, so they dump the whole several hundred metric tons of chemical, including cyanide, chlor, mercury, and all the toxic into the ocean, and that caused the death of over 100 tons of fish, all kind of fish, small fish, big fish. The fish that deep down underwater, also floating up and die, on the beach. Also bird, marine life destroyed. So and the Formosa and also the government deny that they caused a problem 3 months before they accepted, because there was a pressure from international and inside Vietnam. Many 10,000 protesters, they know exactly Formosa did that, because the fish, and or the water, ocean water, the red that form Formosa blend. So everybody know that all along, but they try to cover up by, government send officer over there to swim on that water, and then have a party using seafood. Who know that seafood where they come from? But anyway, they did that. And for your information, one of the guy who came for the festival, for the party, now he had cancer. It's nothing we need to laugh about, but I would say that they very messy on how they handling that. By the end, they admit it, and they instantly say that they're gonna pay $500 million for the damage, without having any study or any assessment to find out what exactly was the damage. And then the worst thing they done, they pay that to the government instead of paying to the victims. So it created a lot of problem that 10,000 of people got paid nothing, or some people got paid very marginal compared with what they have lost. So people have to, go elsewhere to find work. They go to the southern provinces, or go to Cambodia or Thailand, wherever they can go to find work. Not one or two, but 10,000 of them have to do that. And some people, they have money that they can travel to Taiwan. Here he go to Taiwan to do the labor job over there. They have to live away from their family. They have to put their house or their land or whatever they have for mortgage, so they can borrow the money to pay for the connection fee, what they call it, the fee that they have to pay for the government, and also for the broker that they find their job. So it's very expensive, but somewhere around $5,000 to $10,000, depend on the job and where they can look work. But once again, the village along the coastline, most of young people, the people who can work, have to go out to look for a job. and then only older people and the young people and many children have to stop school because their parents no longer afford it, you know. So the the area not just devastated because of the environment destroyed it, but also the social, you know, impact on their lives that make them very difficult. Um, People try to um, sue Formosa in Vietnam, but you know, most of fishermen, they live very simple life. They never have to sue anyone or know how to sue or how to do all the paperwork. So there was a group of people come to the village to help them. So all those government arrest them, put in a prison. Some prison term are long as 20 years, 14 years, 12 years. Few women have small children, and you have 12 years, 9 years, and 10 years in prison. And some they run away. You know, several of them they still on the run right now because of they don't want to get arrested. So you can see that we're talking about environment got destroyed and life got destroyed, and nobody protect them. The government, you know, sided with the Formosa, so they both, you know, work together to, I mean, punish anyone who want to do something. So that's why the bishop in the area went outside of Vietnam, begging, asking for help. They went to Europe. They got some help over there, and then they came to US. So we met with him, and he said that no way that they can do anything inside Vietnam. So please help them. So we found a group called Justice for Formosa Victim that we gather about, you know, over 100 people. I mean, they actually join and help that they come from 10 different countries around the world. So we start raising fund. We start searching for lawyers who willing to help on the case, so we can bring the lawsuit to international, you know, outside Vietnam. So after we have 5 group of lawyers involved in the case, and then they figured it out that they need to sue in Taiwan first, because Formosa Vietnam comprised by at least 13 company that they from Taiwan. They have their headquarters in Taiwan, and office in Taiwan and everything. So we sue in Taiwan. I think that's June 11, 2019, that you know, where we filed a lawsuit at district court in Taipei. That the lawsuit was thrown out, and then we get to the higher court, it got thrown out. And when we get up to Supreme Court, luckily Supreme Court give us the jurisdiction, which is, you know, you cannot imagine. We cry, the victim cry when we have that. But so the Supreme Court, you know, I mean, send the file to High Court. So the High Court reduced the number of the defendant who responsible for this. So our lawyer think that, you know, we could get most of them, you know, because the damage is very huge, and also we need some company that have a capacity, can clean up the polluted area and the ocean. So we need more than just 13 of them. So that's why we send a file, I mean, to appeal in Supreme Court again, and now we are waiting on the decision, you know, of the Supreme Court. I just want to make a parenthesis here that the Vietnam case is like a double trouble. You know, we here in US, like Diane or Sharon in Louisiana, you know, they can form group, they can collect data, they can do that. I mean, the government maybe not helpful in front or try to hide some for what reason, but here at least people have the freedom to do things they need to, and then they're not going to be arrested or thrown in a prison, or got punished from government from many different way. So double trouble. But first trouble is Formosa, stubborn, greedy, cheating and everything, and then second problem is the government that who not stand up for people, who not work for the people, and then they have power, who they punish people. Like you can see, like I'm talking about people in prison now, and then we try our best to help their family. Sometimes when we help them, they got problem too. So the other day I met with Kim and Tim at Diane house, and Kim told me something that I'm thinking very hard about it. She said that we need to help them we need to fight for them outside of Vietnam, because in Vietnam look like if they do anything, they get into big problems. So we may need something here or outside here somehow that we can help them and we can get a result for them. So keep thinking, and I hope that when Kim and Tim not so busy, we can get together and to brainstorm about a way to help these people. And nothing, I don't, it won't bother my life. I live okay over here. I work, I got money, I can spend whatever, freedom here, but not people over there. And then many of them are children, and then many of them it's 5 years, over 5 years now they live it like that. So it looked very painful. Once again, I appreciate for giving me an opportunity to talk about people, a victim of Formosa in Vietnam, and I hope that somehow student, teacher, everybody can come up with something to help me, to help them. I would very much appreciate it. Yes.
Nancy, thank you so much for your work and for sharing it with us here. I mean, the way that it calls upon us not only to remember how impacted communities bear the burden of producing the evidence that they've been harmed, but in your case points to just the incredible pressure not to produce that evidence, which in turn calls upon us for yet another reason to work transnationally and linking university researchers, including students, to these communities. And so I hope going forward that we can figure out how to use the case study analysis that we do to understand environmental injustice to help evidence the case in Vietnam. Tim has played a lead role as the designer of our digital platform, in which we're housing and building the archive, trying to build pathways between university researchers and affected communities and activists working on their behalf. Tim, can you just quickly give us your kind of vision for that, and then we'll open for questions from the audience.
Right. Thanks, Kim, and thanks everybody on the panel. I think as we learned from all the contributions now, it's really important to build connections between the sites, but also recognize the differences. So even just the different kinds of lawsuits that are going on. So for example, the lawsuit that Diane has been involved in was a clean water lawsuit, while in Taiwan, people are doing a toxic tort. So they're trying to claim a compensation for family members that they have lost for cancer, while in Louisiana, it's about delaying that Formosa comes to town in the first place. So I think what we need is a digital archive that can inspire action across these sites, but also recognize the strategies and tactics really need to be different or kind of appropriate for every site. And the other thing is just the history of environmental activism, which Diane is kind of a beacon for, but also the Formosa case. I mean, I really hope that Formosa does not come to Louisiana, but we need the data and the strategies. We need to preserve that. how did people, the coalition around Rice St. James, this really impressive coalition, how did they prevent Formosa from coming in? So that's another reason to keep this collective memory alive. And then again, I think it's a question for us researchers and students. How can we use that data? How can we add new layers of interpretation to data that is there? I think Joy really drew that out, that we need this creative approach to thinking what data counts, what new data can we bring in. And just an example, a lot of the data that we have collected for this archive was stored on people's hard drives. Both researchers and activists have just things on their hard drives. In Diane's case, I mean, these things, they can be easily gone in the next hurricane. Researchers, they move on to a new project. So I think this archive is really a place to gather that data, but also make sure that people in different communities can work with it, in different ways. So that's kind of the challenge. And yeah, looking forward to the Q&A. We already had a question, actually. I think I can just call upon Claudia, if that's okay. Claudia, did you want to ask your question live or just put it in the chat? And by the way, also Claudia said that she really appreciates the speakers, their lived experience and rich historical perspectives.
Thank you so much. My question was based on the Black erasure, if you will, and I believe the speaker had said that we needed to, that there's a need to address the fact that this is an area that occurs very frequently. And I would like to know what suggestions Joy might have to address that. Thank you.
Sure. I think understanding the way that the history behind your lawmaking, the way that the ordinances are set up, like just being familiar with your council members and the history of it, and ways in which, if you see the critical issues in your community, look at the pieces of the puzzle that led to it. And in many cases, I know for us, it was a lack of knowledge about the laws and a sense of there's nothing that we can do about it. And someone spoke to the local representation that we had and how they can be so frustrating and so intimidating that they scare you off. So just being aware of, those, being aware of those that is intentionally part of the system and is designed to scare you away, makes you, in my opinion, made us more passionate about going in, finding out, again, understanding those ordinances, looking at even going to news archives and understanding the history of civil rights within your particular community will point you to many of the ways in which Black community has been erased. And I will say too, by all means, reach out to legal organizations that have experience with civil rights. In our case, we have civil rights, we have environmental law issues, and they can certainly be a positive force, that helps you gain ground and being able to interpret all the aspects of the system that's happening. But also too, as much as expert knowledge is important, for us, it was a combination of expert and also local knowledge, local history. So we had everyone from my 94-year-old, great uncle, he's contributing valuable information. My sister being able to pull up a map and understand, what zoning looks like and what a map, or asking questions. So just assemble a team, identify the key issues impacting your community and start digging, of what were the things, what were the laws that led to this? And you will certainly find the Black erasure, and then you will find an anatomy of how that erasure happened.
I'll add that I think as in building the archive and in teaching, what I want to put in front of students is a long, long list of many, many different ways Black erasure happens, so that it might look different in other places, but your kind of eyes are all open at the many possibilities. Similarly, with procedural injustice, it happens in such small nano ways as well as huge ways. And another example I think of, I recently talked to Diane about helping me build a list of all the different ways data can be used to lie. And again, as a teacher, if I can put these lists in front of our students so that together we can learn to kind of see in the shadows, so to speak, I think that it's a way to build our capacity to see things like Black erasure.
We had another question by Christabel, I think, who has their hand up. Do you want to? I think you should be able to post your question.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you all for sharing your just your experiences and everything. I feel like it means a lot just to hear like a variety of like opinions and facts and everything like that. I had a question about the I don't know who was speaking on like the plantations because I missed some of it. I had to like go out for a second. So with regard to the plantations, I know there was some just something around there's still some that are profiting from it. And are these profits going to people that have been like directly like impacted, and also are you kind of like pushing to no, we wish wishing to kind of like dismantle the whole system of profiting from the plantations or close the plantations like at all? And if so, do you think that would continue this erasure of the Black experience or some sort of like invisibilization of it? Because there are aspects of history that are really important for us to know, but again, the profit of it is just like a little bit confusing. If you could clear that up for me, please.
So yes, so when it comes to a plantation, and by the way, great question, and you hit the complexity of, of plantations and the rationale, for their existence or for, their ultimate, for their erasure, right? In the way that for plantations, I think they are valuable learning experiences. They also have archives that are important to understanding, the ancestry of, and specifically my enslaved ancestors. But then also it shows you the way of which disenfranchisement, occurred, and, exploitation even after emancipation. The plantation system existed into the 1970s or 80s that looked very similar, to the way that it looked pre-emancipation, and that some of the descendants were living still on that plantation and living in slave cabins. So, that's one aspect of it. But the idea of these plantations still getting profit, and what they'll do is, it's kind of tricky because most of them are set up as nonprofit organizations. Whitney Plantation is a nonprofit organization as well. But what you have to be careful about is that many of these plantations have separate corporations, either venue spaces or hotels or restaurants that are for profit. And so they are still continuing to get money, that can be used for profit. And even in a nonprofit situation does not mean that it ameliorates your obligation to the descendant community, right? So I think that plantations are not the only spaces in which marginalization, disenfranchisement, and exploitation of Black people existed, right? So for us, in a sense, they are ground zero. They are the symbolic representation of it. But there are many institutions in which race was so much of an issue, so much of a problem for us, and for all communities, but speaking specifically to the Black experience. So while I understand people's sensitivity towards plantations, and look, if folks don't want to visit, I do not push anyone, to put themselves through the trauma of a plantation. But I hope that our dissatisfaction, our recognition of the trauma that we experience on a plantation site that we also acknowledge that there are other systems of injustice that are just as triggering or just as traumatic, but it might be more subversive. And so I think that just, again, speaking up for, the representation, the narratives of the inclusion of enslaved people. But for me, I'm a former business professor, so I'm always about how does this help out the descendant community here and now. And I think that not only plantations, but also the tourist commissions with publicly funded money should be held accountable for making sure that that money goes directly back to descendant communities.
Joy, can you share what I've learned from you about the role plantations can play, and particularly the Whitney, in preserving the history of Black resistance in Louisiana?
Yes, and Whitney it's a slavery museum, but it's also a museum of memory. It's a museum of the African, beautiful West African culture that has influenced, everything from the music to the food to the language. And also, most importantly, we focus on the resistance of enslaved people. And so one of the memorials that we have on site, and author Clint Smith, he featured Whitney Plantation in the book, How the Word Is Passed. I think the most impactful monument for him was a memorial to the 1811, the participants of the 1811 slave revolt, which we believe is the biggest slave revolt that occurred in the United States, and is probably the least well known. But it shows the level at which the participants were willing to go to fight for their freedom. The insurgency was put down by the local militia. The people that were involved who didn't escape were, many of them, executed on the spot, and they were, others were tried, found guilty, and their heads were cut off, placed on stakes along the levee. And so we have a memorial that is depicting that very real, very gruesome, but necessary part of our history.
I'll ask a very hard question. Can any of you speak to the challenges? We know the importance of connecting historic disadvantage to analysis and action today to address environmental injustice. How do you, and there's different ways to connect the history. There's the kind of history you just told, Joy. I know Diane is working to recall a memory of a vibrant fishing community in Calhoun County so that it can be a beacon for what they're trying to rebuild. But tell us how the connection between past and present is part of the work of environmental advocacy.
I can very quickly state that one of our missions, the sugarcane fields throughout plantation country and the land are also the unmarked burial grounds for enslaved people who are our ancestors. So we are utilizing cemetery laws to get these spaces designated, revered as the sacred spaces that they are. But the other side of that is that we are looking, it's a way of protecting the land. And so if we have the land protected, then we don't have to worry about these threats from petrochemical industry.
Yeah, that's a really nice example of the protecting the cemeteries and an end in itself and as a tactic. Caitlin, did you have something to add?
Yes, certainly. I was just going to say, I know you spoke briefly on barriers or challenges, and I think Joy can probably attest to this and many others on the call, but especially in like South Louisiana and along the Gulf Coast, a lot of times some of our indigenous populations, Black and Brown BIPOC communities have been promised jobs or, better economic welfare as it relates to petrochem, oil and gas industry jobs. And so really trying to carve out a new narrative around what it looks like to be a part of just transition or renewable resources or an industry that isn't killing our people is definitely a part of that connectivity when we're talking about trying to get communities to understand how some of the petrochem industry is impacting their everyday lives, but then also, not really worth the cost in terms of health versus finances. And so really having those hard conversations with folks that look like me that have had, generations and generations of workers in these industries and chemical plants. And the list is long. And I know I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but it's just one of the many challenges and barriers in South Louisiana and around the country that we face on a daily in terms of trying to get folks to outweigh those risks and understand what really is of value when we're talking about environmental justice and trying to combat environmental racism.
Caitlin, can you just give us a glimpse of what the vision for Just Transition Louisiana looks like? I mean, it's challenging everywhere, but I think it's especially challenging there.
Absolutely. And so obviously the vision, much like everywhere, as you've stated, Kim, is for us to be able to take part in renewable resources using Louisiana's rich in resources and we don't even realize it, as a state. And so I think really trying to, like I said earlier, do away with this narrative that in order for us to be successful or wealthy or just have financial stability, buying into oil and gas and petrochem is just the way to go, and really drawing a new Louisiana for our elected officials, for our folks that are impacted on a daily. And what that looks like is connectivity in terms of transition, transportation for our low wage workers, more reliable transportation for, impacted folks every day, but then also making sure that the stuff that we're bringing into our homes and feeding our children and, investing in on a daily doesn't look like what we've been doing for the last few decades in the state of Louisiana. And so really an education moment, an opportunity to have bring that education component to the table with folks, like I said, that look like me and you along the coast that are really driven by this narrative with our elected officials that also look like us, that we cannot have a successful Louisiana without oil and gas. And so one thing I will lift up that I find very exciting, which is almost like a blessing in disguise, post-Hurricane Ida, I've never heard this many folks in Louisiana talking about a different tomorrow, a better Louisiana, whatever side you are in terms of politics. One thing that we can all agree on in this moment is that we don't want to keep dealing with the same natural disasters over and over that, as you mentioned earlier, are going to keep getting more aggressive and more frequent, but also being left with rebuilding every single time. What does it look like for us to have a Louisiana that isn't constantly in disaster mode and crisis mode, and really looking homelessness and some of those root causes around environmental justice in the face and having those hard conversations beforehand. And so for me, that's what we're trying to perpetuate on a daily at my job, in my community, with people of faith, and just trying to have those hard conversations before the next hurricane and before the next storm, et cetera.
The stories of mutual aid and what I've learned are hurricane parties where there's just intense mutual sharing in a community to feed and house people is really, from Louisiana, is really an inspiring model for all of us to think with and imagining a just transition. Do others have comments? Diane, might you say something about the need to recall special histories in order to envision a just transition in Calhoun County that would revive the fishing community, and the incredibly strong and specific vision you have for that? When I was with Diane, with Tim recently, she literally drew for us what the new wharfs would look like and the new fish house. So Diane, share with us that vision and the kind of history that needs to be built to go with it.
Okay. Well, I guess historically, our community on the mid-Texas Gulf Coast, we have been commercial fishing communities. And matter of fact, even my little community that is now, you go down the main street as you did, I think with me last week, it's it's totally dead. It's totally boarded up. And this area a few decades ago was where more shrimp were imported out of this place than anywhere in the United States, anywhere. And now there is not a single fish house where a local shrimper can get fuel, can get ice, where he can sell his shrimp, and where he can tie his boat. And, you know, in not too long ago, I can remember where our community had 100 fishermen and we had 5 fish houses. And now the shrimp season is over with in 2 weeks, and we probably have maybe 5 or 6 shrimp boats. And so
Diane is frozen for me. For others, yeah. And I'll just remind people or channel Diane for a moment. One of the parts of the big legal settlement she got has money put aside for funding this new infrastructure. And so the community has to come together to organize to figure out what that is. And something that's very inspiring is that they're learning from the example and the leadership of people who have worked to build cooperatives of Black farmers in the US Southeast. And it's a powerful example of how expertise in one area, building, you know, on land farmer cooperative capacity, can be stretched to help a community rebuild fishing infrastructure and fishing capacity. And I know that embedded in so many of the stories we've heard here are people being really expert in what they do, but also stretching beyond what they're used to do to figure out how to step up and address a problem. And that's such an important example and model for students who are coming into high levels of expertise, but will inevitably find themselves in situations where they have something to share, but it's not something that they're officially credentialed to do. We need to close soon. Tim, can you share the slide pointing to an event where people have the opportunity to come back together in the very near term?
Yes.
So this Wednesday, and Caitlin is one of the hosts, so may have something to add. You can join a webinar featuring St. James Parish activist Sharon Levine, working with Stop the Money Pipeline, Earthworks Action, Acre, Friends of the Earth, the Sunrise Project, and Break Free from Plastic. So an interesting coalition of environmental organizations. And alongside the discussion, the groups will be fundraising for Hurricane Ida Mutual Aid in partnership with Rise St. James. And I think Tim can put in the chat a link to where you can register for that session. So thank you again for joining us today. Please stay in touch and rise for environmental justice. Thank you again.